Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly conversation. This week, your host is Naseem Ahmed, and I am really delighted to have on the show today an author, someone who's been very active on the Palestinian issue for many, many decades, I would say, Blake Alcott. Blake, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor. Yeah, we
So,
we met we met first, I guess, maybe 12, 15 years ago. Yeah.
yeah, and several times afterwards.
Mm.
And I've invited Blake to discuss his book, The Rape of Palestine, a Mandate Chronology. The book was published, I think it's 2023. It's a huge source of information. It catalogs, it's actually a chronology of the dialogue is captured in documents between the colonized Palestinians and the British colonizers running from November 1917 through 1948. And basically traces the ins and outs of the 3 decades of robbery of Palestine from the indigenous community. And Blake, um, he's been working on this book for, I would say, many, many years. His background is in philosophy. He's done all kinds of work. He has a PhD in sustainable strategies, which he acquired in 2013. And there's lots of things, work and that you've done, Blake. So I want to ask, what's your journey to the book, though? How did you decide to write a book on Palestine? I'm given your CV is quite extensive, and you've done so many different things in your life, even carpentry at one point. How did you arrive at writing such a book?
Okay, I don't want to go on too long about myself, but yeah, I did study philosophy, a bachelor's degree, and if I was a self-employed cabinet maker for about 30 years. Then I went back to school and did environmental policy. I got an MPhil and then a PhD in sustainability strategies. And in 2009, with Operation Cast Lead, I got bit by the Palestine bug. I hadn't really followed the Palestine thing before that. And as usual, I started reading and reading and reading everything I could about it. Um, and at one point, I realized that I myself and even people at conferences that I went to, let's say at SOAS or somewhere, they weren't quite straight on the difference between, let's say, the Peel Commission report of 37 and the MacDonald White Paper of 39. That's just one example. Uh, and or the Palestine Arab Congresses, who were they? When were they? And what did they say? And I think in general also, except for Palestinians and people perhaps like yourself, who are really deep in the issue, we don't know all that much about the Palestinian intellectual resistance during the mandate. The mandate, just to remind people, started more or less in 1917-18 and ended May 15th, 1948. So we're dealing with 30 years. And so a friend of mine who was teaching, Ahmed Azam, was teaching at Birzeit, and he encouraged me, he said, you know what, we sort of need a chronology where you can really strictly by date follow all sorts of documents, white papers, manifestos by the Palestinians, debates in the House of Lords or the House of Commons, etc. So it's all laid out chronologically. Could I just show, this is an example. Nasim said it was a big book. Well, this is just volume
Yeah,
one.
nearly 1,005. I have the PDF copy. It's 1,500 pages
Yeah.
long. So, which is why I was going to ask you. I mean, how do you expect the readers to use your book? I mean, it is an encyclopedia of all the documents,
Mm,
something like some 500 entries in there. So,
yes.
how do you want the readers of the book to
Well, I think for most people, it's a
come to your
reference
book?
book.
So, go on.
I actually have a couple of friends who claim that they're actually reading it.
cover to cover.
Almost 1,600 pages. But it's basically, if you hear something, let's say you want to know more about the Balfour Declaration or about Herbert Samuel or uh, Musa Alami, what was his role in the resistance, or George Antonius, or these people. Well, you can go to the book and find specific information. Um, and in each entry, as you said, 490 entries, and those are documents going one way or the other from the Palestinians to the British, or the other way around. And some of them a little bit more loose to some U.S. Americans, or to even to the Zionists. But I leave the Zionist colonizers pretty much out of the picture. I mean, if there's a Palestine triangle of the British, the indigenous Palestinians, and the European Zionist settlers, if that's sort of the triangle of interaction, I'm leaving. This is just the British Palestinian line on the triangle, because I think there's a lot more literature about the other two relationships, the British with the Zionists. Um, Wrong. Between the Zionists and the Palestinians, there's not much, because I frankly don't think much was actually recorded. There's not much in the archives directly. I have a few entries, maybe 10 or 11, dealing with conversations between Ben Gurion and Auni Abdul Hadi.
Well, I think it's quite consistent. What you're saying now is consistent with what we know already, which is that Palestinians were invisible in all this.
Yeah,
There wasn't really much interaction with the Palestinians, engagement with the Palestinians, because
yeah,
Palestinians were, even now they are invisible. If you think
yeah,
about it,
yeah.
Trump is discussing ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Gaza. And there's no discussion as to whether the Palestinians would want that.
No.
And so we see a constant erasure of the fact that there is a history there of Palestinians
Oh,
of
definitely.
being there. So
And in
and
that
so
sense, just let me just add real quickly. In that sense, um, I'm glad the book really does. Um, Palestinians do get to say their piece, because each entry, I have a lot of direct quotations. Uh, and it also says who wrote it to whom, and the date, and the official title of it, and where you can get it. A lot of it's online or in books, but maybe half of it is only at the British Archives, the National Archives in NQ in London. So that's what I mean. If you go to an entry, you can find out all these things and find the original document. And it's very high quality what the Palestinians
well,
wrote.
you have a section called the voiceless many, don't you? And in that section, you have a
Exactly.
number of documents which shows how Palestinians tried to oppose Zionist colonization of of their territory. So which one of those documents do you think is worth noting, just for the purpose of a conversation? You have numerous documents in that chapter, the voiceless many, and there's also
Um,
another section on, for example, if I go through my list, sons of the soil. And again, this section focuses on how Palestinians, being the indigenous community, they mounted a challenge to these Zionist project with the British. They would have commissions going to Churchill and other British officials seeking a hearing to tell the British that we are the indigenous community. We do not wish for a foreign project, political project, to be imposed upon us. We are seeking a secular state for Jews, Christians, Muslims, all Palestinians in that territory. So you have a number of chapters focusing on that. There are a number of documents which detail that phase in history of Palestinian opposition, resistance to Zionist colonization.
yeah. That thing about the voiceless many, that was a quote from somebody who was of course referring to the Palestinians. And you're very right about the erasure. And that was literal, because, for instance, one of the most important documents that I deal with in detail, and when I say deal, that's some of the entries are 10, 15 pages long, and this is one of them, was the King Crane Commission that went to Palestine, went to Syria to find out what the people wanted. And it's a very long and detailed report, and it comes out very clearly, very simply for independence. And there is a distinction to be made. Uh, the Palestinians uh, objected to sort of two things, and one was the any sort of colonization, any sort of tutelage, which is the word in the League of Nations covenant. The civilized countries should go to the uncivilized countries and teach them how to live and how to organize their polity. Um, and they didn't want any of that. And they dressed it up and renamed it Mandate, which was nonsense. But they just said, no, we don't really need that. At most, they said, okay, a few advisors for 3 or 5 years. Okay. But after that, just plain old independence. But the second thing, of course, they didn't like, to put it mildly, was the pro-Zionist content of this particular mandate, which of course wasn't there with the mandate for Jordan or Iraq or or Syria or Lebanon. So the Palestinians had this dual problem with somebody else running their country for them anyway, and with this particular project. And just let me, I yeah, I think it's important to know a bit about the demography. Less than 10% of the population of Palestine at the beginning of the mandate was Jewish. And about half of them were indigenous Jews, Arab Jews, who didn't have any interest in the Zionist project whatsoever. So we're talking about 4 or 5% European Zionists. And for instance, I've listened to some podcasts about the Palestine issue, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., for instance, said last summer that in 1918 there was a Jewish majority in Palestine. And you see, people don't really know the facts. And that's, I hope the book, uh, you know,
Yeah,
it's
I think one of the important things missing in the version of the story which Europeans have, pro-Israeli Europeans have, is not understanding how quickly the Jewish community in Palestine went from 5% to, say, 35% when the country was divided as a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. If that kind of shift was underway in the West, where a foreign
yeah,
migrant community went from 5%, the 5% that were indigenous to the territory, went to 35%, I think you would have a civil war. And
yeah,
we've seen that already in parts of Europe where there's such a resistance to migrants and foreigners, even though they're 5%, 6%, despite being in the UK, for example, for the past 60, 70, if not more years. And still, we're only to Muslims in this case, 5, 6% of the population. The Muslim population did not go from 5% to 35% within the space of 30 years. So there's a version of that story which is not told in the West, but your book picks that up. And I think where you start off is really important in your book. So if I can ask you a question about that, it kind of reminded me of Rashid Khalid's book, 100G War on Palestine. And your book is kind of similar in the sense that you are also documenting a century of wars and campaigns to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians and take over their territory. And you're doing it through the various documents and the letters that are publicly available. So the first entry in your book is in a chapter called Before the Balfour Declaration, is the entry of Yusuf the Al-Khalidi. And he is, I think, the great granddad of Rashid Khalidi, who published the book 100 Year War in Palestine. And the exchange between him and, I think, Herzl or a rabbi, where he
Rabbi
warns that.
Zadok, the
Yes,
leader of
that's
the
the one.
French.
Yes. So,
Yeah,
do you want to speak about then why you felt it was important to begin from that moment in history?
that was 1899. And um, Al-Khalidi said a couple of basic points to that rabbi, because everybody knew that Zionism was in the works. This was 2 years after the first Zionist Congress in Basel. And the Palestinians knew a lot about Zionism and the project. And so basically, what Khalidi is saying to this rabbi is, uh, Jews are fine. We've lived with them forever, and they have achieved very much, and we like them, and they're fine. But it's the political project of taking over the country that we object to. And this is something that came up time and time again. The Palestinians threw out to the British had three demands: independence or self-determination, no more immigration, and no more land sales to Zionists, also no more Zionist immigration. Um, and that's how the population did the percentage of of non-indigenous increased, and that's because the immigrants were forced upon the Palestinians. And again, to get back to the basic point, everybody was talking in those days, Woodrow Wilson and everybody, about the consent of the governed. That's why we fought World War One. But nobody cared about the consent of the Palestinians or the Syrians for that matter. So again, we get back to these themes of uh, the simple message. It's so simple. We just want to rule our own house. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I found, yeah, Yusuf's warning quite prophetic. If we look at Gaza now, it, I think people who study genocide will say that in any ethno-nation state project, if there is a large um, majority of a different ethnic group, genocide is kind of
Mm,
baked into the whole project itself. And you
mm,
could almost see, yeah, you could almost see Yusuf imagining a scenario where the early Zionist community, with the backing of the Brits at the time and later on the Americans and the major superpowers at the time, that they would have the means and the capacity to be able to impose horrific violence to make sure the project becomes successful. And and I think it by goes without saying that it's the success of Zionism to create a Jewish state in Palestine when Jews are a minority that was always going to lead to a form of ethnic cleansing and a form of genocide, which we are seeing in Gaza right now. It's not a genocide in one instance in history, but it's a genocide that's taking place over many, many decades. And what we are seeing now is one of the worst phases of that genocide in Gaza. So, in that sense, I think Yusuf was so prophetic in warning against embarking on such a project to the rabbi.
yeah, you're right. I just read what he said. One of the quotes is, "By what right do the Jews want it, Palestine, for themselves?" In
Yeah.
other words, not to just immigrate and integrate and be there, but to take it over. And he saw that coming. Um, and yeah, when I think about the Gaza situation, and I look back at what the British did, and of course that was what Israel did after 48 was more violent. The British were violent enough, but it was more violent. And it seems like we've had 120 some odd years of a slow genocide. And since October 7th, we've had a fast genocide or a dense genocide. But that's the only difference. But you're right, it's an integral part because they always said, the Zionists always said, we do need a majority. It's a really bad look if we're a
Mm.
minority. And so how do you get a majority? You have to, one of the Zionist MPs, James de Rothschild, said, how can we make a Jewish national home without Jews and without land? So you had to bring in the people, but the actual expulsion was advocated, compulsory expulsion across the Jordan was advocated in the Peel Commission report in 1937. But the British withdrew that. They retreated from that position quite fast. It was just too much. So the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing happened actually as of 1948.
Yeah. One of the sections in your book is Britain throws the first stone, and in that you cover the entries include the Balfour Declaration, McMahon Hussein correspondence, and various other correspondence, including the White Paper, which was issued to stop Zionist immigration, Jewish immigration into Palestine because of opposition from the Palestinians. So I guess you can say that Britain was giving conflicting messages, making conflicting promises, as was the case. Um, but I mean, of those betrayals, though, which one do you think was the most consequential? And also, when I was reading your book, we spoke earlier about how um, the plan was always to ensure that the Zionist project comes to fruition. And Palestinians were erased, were not consulted in any shape or form. And when you read another book, Lobbying for Zionism by Ilan Pape, he
I've read it.
covers, he covers, I think, something like over 200 years of history of lobbying for Zionism, beginning with Christian Zionism. And on that section, prior to the creation of the State of Israel, you see frantic lobbying uh, against the Brits to make sure that they toe the Zionist line or they work in favor of Zionism or that they don't adopt any policies that is contrary to the Zionist agenda. I guess the white paper is kind of an exception to the rule. Yeah, so do you want to speak about that and how Britain um, issued all these conflicting promises
Yeah,
and
I
pledges?
mean, at the bottom line of the British was support for Zionism, and there were simply exceptions. Now, people on the ground in Palestine and some politicians, one High Commissioner, John Chancellor, from 28 to 31, I think he was, and people who did investigative reports like Walter Shaw, John Hope Simpson, um, and of course King Crane, but that was a US American thing. Um, they were the exceptions. They said this is really stupid. For one thing, it's costing us a lot of money to try to keep the peace. It's costing our soldiers' lives. It's costing our reputation, and it's all just because of Zionism. They said it very clearly. But in London, that's where the lobby was. And that's where always at a higher level, prime ministers like Ramsay MacDonald in 1931, and of course Churchill throughout. Churchill is the main villain uh, of my book because he was a racist. Uh, there were some racist comments he made to the Peel Commission in camera, also in secret, in 1937, which I believe were just revealed in 2017. And they're really ugly. And he was, of course, the colonist par excellence. Uh, but the thing is, there were only two white papers in the sense of uh, official British policy approved by Parliament and by the government. The Churchill White Paper of 1922, which made the famous, infamous claim that the Jews, the Jewish people, have a historic title to Palestine based on their presence there and their power there 2 or 3 thousand years before. This is such an important pillar of Zionism. You can't overestimate it. And finally, in 1939, Malcolm MacDonald, for whatever reason, maybe the British government just wanted to not ruin things in the Near East with the Arabs, or maybe I personally think Malcolm MacDonald was listening to the Palestinians. That's my personal view. But that white paper did say, uh, after 5 years, 75,000 more immigrants, the indigenous will have an absolute veto over any further immigration. And it said within 10 years, there'll be absolute independence with a with an indigenous, also non-Jewish or non-Zionist majority. But there were some loopholes. There was some ambiguous language. But that white paper was the exception. The basic thing was just for the project. And when Labour took over in 1945, they went back to the two-state solution, to partition, and they actually abstained on all UN votes about the future of Palestine.
That white paper was also the beginning of the intensification of Jewish terrorism against the Brits. I think it's
Yeah.
at that time where, when Jewish terrorist groups like the Haganah, Sturgan, they were considered um, the biggest terrorist threat to UK interest in the
Yeah.
Middle East, and of course they bombed the King David Hotel and British politicians as well.
Mhm.
Um, so. Um, so that had a huge
Yeah.
shift in Zionist thinking at the time, that they did not consider
Tom
the Brits. Sorry, go
Tom
ahead.
Suarez has written two wonderful books on that issue. He's in detail. He in those books, Thomas Suarez, you can see the whole thing about the Zionist terrorism.
I find it helps to think about the situation prior to the creation of the State of Israel as one where you have one community who is seeking to secede from what was an existing political project, a mandate to create a Palestinian state. But then you have immigrants from Europe, Jewish immigrants who want to secede from that political project and create their own Jewish supremacist entity, a separate political state. So during that period, what were the various forms of petitions, resistance, or Palestinians were offering? Because you have a section that said the voices of the many, and you document a number of Palestinian petitions, protests. And a lot of these protests were, as the British themselves have documented, a result of Palestinian fear that a foreign entity is torpedoing their aspirations for a state and their own self-determination. And their state and their self-determination is one for all the population in Palestine, not
Hmm.
for a specific
Hmm.
one ethnic community or one religious group, but it's for everybody, Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Hmm.
But that was torpedoed by, as I like to say, by a cessationist movement. So, what were the kind of petitions they were making, and what were the key documents from that period, and what were the types of resistance?
You mean the period, what
Or
just,
in this chapter on the voiceless many from 1919 all the way up
yeah,
to
you know,
1947.
you're putting me on the spot. I'll have to go back and
Sorry.
check it out. I
We
can't, this was 1990. Yeah, that was the important period. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm getting at is
uh,
the periods when Palestinians delegations would go to Churchill and say,
yes,
we do not want the Balfour Declaration as part
yeah,
of the mandate.
yeah.
But they were ignored, as we've seen throughout history over and over again. Palestinians are somehow disappeared, vanished from any kind of discussion.
Mhm.
So these are delegations of, I would say, mainly Christians who are petitioning Churchill to say, look, don't ignore the majority community there, which is
Mhm.
the Palestinian, indigenous Palestinians, and instead favor a foreign political project, the Zionist project.
Yeah.
So that was the moment I am thinking
Well,
about.
yeah. There were there were seven Palestine Arab Congress sessions between 1919 and 1928, and the important one in my book was in 19 the winter of 1920-21, the third Congress, and they wrote something called um, "Report on the State of Palestine," and I think they were being deliberately ambiguous. State. The condition of Palestine, or actually the political entity of Palestine. They presented it to Churchill and to the first High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, who was a Jewish supremacist. That's one of the documents that I have before the Balfour Declaration in 1915. Herbert Samuel, as a member of cabinet, uh, wrote something which just said, the Jews will do something in Palestine, which is good for the British, for the Palestinians, for the Jews, and for the world. So because they were so good, this is really blatant philo-Semitism or something we can call, but really ridiculous. So Musa Kazem al-Husseini, and he was the president or the leader of the Arab Executive Committee of the Congress. They presented this report, which is a really seminal document, um, to Churchill and Samuel personally in Jerusalem. And Churchill sits there and he says, I am receiving you today, Vosi, as a favor. He's in the Palestinians' country saying he's receiving them and listening to them for an hour or two. So this was just the voiceless many. This was rejected by the British throughout. They knew exactly what the people wanted. There was no question. You didn't even need the King Crane Commission to find that out, that they didn't want Zionism and that they wanted independence. But in this period, maybe I'm throwing too much at you, pardon me, but there's something very, very important, and that was the General Syrian Congress, which was in Damascus. And this
Yeah.
was the time when Syria was still a unit consisting of today's Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine. And they had, starting in 1919 in the summer, they had like a Congress, and they had representatives from all over El Sham. Uh, and in the end, in March, April, May, June 1920, they had a 147 article constitution that they passed, and Emir Faisal was the king. Otherwise, it's what you said, an absolutely sectarian uh, uh, polity. And that's what the Palestinians demanded from the British explicitly the whole time. They said, this is just what we want has nothing to do with ethnicity and religion. It's just the people who are here. But of course, the French in July 1920, they put down, they got rid of that. Syria, Al-Sham was an independent country for 4 or 5 months with a wonderful constitution.
There's an interesting book on that, how the West
Yeah, by
destroyed,
Elizabeth Waite. I've got it right here somewhere.
how Britain destroyed of democracy in the Middle East. So again, what you're referencing is an initiative in Syria to have a multi-ethnic,
Yeah,
multi-religious political entity, including Jews, of course, and that would have covered all of Palestine, all of Greater
yeah.
Syria as well. Um,
Thompson, Elizabeth Thompson.
that's it, yeah,
And
Elizabeth
there's a
Thompson.
guy, Ali Alawi. He wrote an equally good book, but it also covers Faisal's period in Iraq. But he covers the Syrian part of it. It's called Faisal One of Iraq, the book. And those two books, Thompson's and Alawi's, are fantastic because people don't know anything about that. It was actually a secular, independent country that existed for a while.
Yeah, and they also had the what we would term Islamists now. They were also part of the project to create a non-sectarian, multi-ethnic, multi-religious
Yeah,
country, what was known as Greater Syria.
yeah.
So it's worth reading that book. Um, so we're coming to the end of our show, and I
Oh,
was going
okay.
to ask you. So first of all, I mean, as we mentioned, there are something like 500 documents that you cover: letters, reports, petitions, things like this. I, I know it's hard to say which is probably the most important. I mean, can you nevertheless try and identify three or four that you think are probably the most significant in the ethnic cleansing and colonization,
Okay.
or in the name in the title of the book, Rape of Palestine?
Okay. I actually prepared for this. Let me rattle them off, okay? It might be a bit tedious, but from the
Go for it.
Palestinian side, I chose seven. One, the resolutions of the seven Palestine Arab Congresses. They said it all and very eloquently, and they presented their resolutions to the world. I mean, anybody could read that. Then there was the General Syrian Congress I just talked about, the report of the State of Palestine, which I also talked about, the Arab Executive Committee to the British Parliament in 1930, because then the British were sort of moving away from Zionism a bit in 1930, with various reports, Shaw and Hope Simpson, even Passfield wasn't the worst. And they made, in November 1930, they made an incredible statement refuting Zionism, refuting British policy. And this is just incredibly high quality work. And At the St. James conferences in 1939, leading up to the MacDonald White Paper, uh, there were many, many sessions, and these records are verbatim. You can go read the minutes of all the meetings. And again, this is incredibly eloquent and went into detail on every point. The Palestinians and the Arab Office prepared a 400-page report to the Anglo-American Committee in 1946, which was another, I think, the 18th investigative committee going to say, hey, what's going on in Palestine? What do the people want? Why is there all this trouble? Because we haven't mentioned the revolt of 36 to 39, but that was incredibly important. Uh, and then lastly, before the UN, people like Albert Hourani and Henry Kattan, uh, Jamal al-Husseini, they made statements to the United Nations and UNSCOP, which are really unsurpassed. Now, let me just rattle off the British ones, if I can find that piece of paper. What you have to know is the Balfour Declaration, King Crane, Churchill White Paper, the investigations of Shaw and Hope Simpson in 1930, the Peel Commission report. These are like the big documents. The MacDonald White Paper of 39, I've mentioned all these already, I notice. And of course, what United Nations Special Committee on Palestine and the UN General Assembly, what they passed in 1947. And this is all you can find out a lot about that in the book, or just references to where you can find out more. Um, I mean, those are just a few examples.
Yeah. I mean, so as I said, it's a huge reservoir of information
Yeah.
and detail. How can readers, viewers access your book? What's the way
Um,
to do it?
is
I
it
mean, I
possible?
have a PDF copy, sorry, and it's really easy to navigate. The PDF, I
Yeah.
think, is perfect. So how can they get a PDF copy? I mean, how would they purchase that, or is it free? I mean, how would they get their hand on
Um,
your book?
the PDF is free on two sites. It's hard to rattle off the URLs,
Oh,
but
I have the link. So if you want, I can put the link
please do.
on our page. Yeah.
There are two places where you can download the whole book for free. And there's a way you can buy the hard copy for the two volumes for about 100 euros and also the ebook for 6 euros from the people who actually made the book. And that's an outfit in Hamburg, and this is www.tradition, also tradition, TREDITION.com. And there you can just order the book and buy it.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll put a link at the
Yeah,
bottom of our
yeah,
conversation as well for
yeah.
viewers. Whoever wants to purchase a PDF or, sorry, download the PDF, they can download the PDF book if they want, or if they so choose to get the hard copy. And just before we finish up, there's another project that you're involved in, which is the ODS in Palestine, which was founded in 2013. Do you want to speak a little bit about this project and where you are at the moment with this ODS in Palestine project?
Yeah, well, about 12 years ago, some of us in Britain started this little group for one democratic state, and we we stayed quite small. We did do a number of events, but then we sort of petered out and we just had a blog and we had a lot of contact with ourselves, amongst ourselves, 60, 70 members. And about 3 years ago, another organization came to life called the ODS Initiative from people in Lebanon. And they're much more active than we are, but ideologically, there's the same really solid group. It's ODSI.co, not COM, CO for Colombia. And that website is fantastic, much better than ours. And there's, of course, the One Democratic State campaign, which consists, to my knowledge, only of uh, people would be in the future would be able to vote and be citizens of the new One Democratic State. In other words, Jewish Israelis and all Palestinians. Because, I mean, an important part of One Democratic State ideology, which you should say at the very beginning, is the right of return. I mean, it's not officially in the title, but of course, the right of return is for all Palestinians. I mean, what are there, about 14 million Palestinians, and over half of them don't live between the river and the sea. And this is sort of the assumption of ODS thinking or the ODS project is that the polity of the citizenship would consist of all these Palestinians, or even if they didn't return, they could be Palestinians with voting rights or citizenship living in
No,
Chile.
just as Jews have a right to return, Palestinians should have a right to return.
Of course, it's
Well,
ironic.
Jews under Israeli law have a right to return, whereas
Yeah,
Palestinians who have been there for centuries, they
I
somehow
know.
don't have a right to return. Yeah,
It's sort of funny that the Zionists they talk about the return, the law of return and the return
yeah,
of the Jews from 2,000, 3,000 years ago. But then they somehow managed to deny the much more recent and tangible and numerous, we could probably say, right of return or expulsion of the Palestinians. So it's quite ironic, actually.
yeah. Blake, thank you very much. As I said, the book is really a wealth of information. I will include the link on
Okay.
our page. It was a pleasure hosting you, and hope to see you again, and see you also for again and for another
Yeah.
conversation with the Middle East
And
Monitor.
and I just one little thing, of
Sorry.
course, as an outsider, I did dedicate the book to the Palestinians because I mean what they've been through and what they're going through now and the courage and the sacrifice that they're making now is, I mean, what Israel's doing in Gaza and the West is unspeakable. Here we are speaking, speaking, speaking. It's actually unspeakable. And the resilience of the Palestinians is absolutely yeah, it's beyond anything I can imagine or have experienced, of course, and my total respect. We should have had a moment of silence at the beginning.
We've had quite a few, and you're right.
No, no,
The
I'm just
resilience, if someone reads your book, goes through your book, you'll see the level of resilience that's been shown by the Palestinians for over a century now. It's remarkable. It's unprecedented. Yeah, that was, thank you so much. 44 minutes. Yeah, it's fine. That's really good. I think what I wanted to really get through is just a taste of what your book's about and get people to download your book. As I
yeah,
said, it's free, so I'll put a link
yeah.
on the page and people will download. And it was useful. I'm going to be using that now as a source of information. It's almost like an encyclopedia. I'll
I know.
Google certain names
I
and
always sort of make a joke. I say I believe it's useful because I use it myself. I mean,
yeah,
if I'm like confused
yeah.
or forget something,
Yeah,
I just go look in this
yeah. That's all right.
because
It's on my laptop now,
it's
downloaded.
yeah, it's weird, I couldn't really answer. I'm not a historian, a professional or anything, but why is this history important? I can't really ask that question. I would have to ask Elon or some
Hmm.
other Rashid Khalidi or other historians how they we tend to automatically end up talking about what went before. Or it's like a bunch of detectives, you see crimes going on and you want to know, okay, who did it? And the British threw the first stone. You want to figure out how did it get to this point? So
Of
that's the
course.
easy answer. But on the other hand, I'm not sure if I could convince anybody that it's worth going back. So you asked informally at the beginning, who is the audience? I think it's people who are already, in the theme, people doing master's degrees or people who just old timers. I have a friend, John Quigley, and he loves the book.
Yeah.
He's written similar things. And we just sort of want to go back and see how
Yeah,
did it get.
I'll be dipping in it now, as I said, and I think there's information there to actually publish a book in itself. You can publish a number of books based on the sources
Ah,
you have provided in your book.
I,
As a
I forgot
beginning,
to I forgot to mention that because I have a theme index, which you undoubtedly saw. I think it's 43 themes. And I actually did that sort of for the Istanbul conference in January. I took 5 or 6, 7 themes, and you go through all of the entries. The theme index shows which entries deal with that theme. Let's
hmm,
say British racism, let's say one democratic state, let's say the historic connection of the Jews, which entitles them to political say in the present. And these things, and you can go through the whole book and write either an essay or a small book by doing that, by tracing it, by tracing the idea through those 30 years.
Okay, Blake, thank you so much. And if you come down to London anytime, drop me a line and it'd be nice to see you.
Oh, I will. I will. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, and Viva
See you later.
Palestina,
Viva
as
Palestina.
always.
Take care.
As
Bye-bye.
always. Bye-bye. Thanks.